"Bury me here," she begged. The rancher pulled the palm fronds, and his hands began to tremble. Jedediah Stone's ranch was a desolate stretch of earth, a place that reeked of solitude, unspoken grief, and the bitter resignation of a man long past caring. He knelt beside the dying woman, not with pity, but with the grim practicality of a man assessing a broken-down horse. This was just another complication in a life built on them. But she lay near the forbidden place, the wild palm grove, Lillian's Folly. A patch of green defiance he hadn't touched since the day he'd put his wife in the ground, a memory too raw to bear. The woman's eyes fluttered open, dark pools reflecting a final sunset. Her request wasn't for a doctor, but a whisper that froze the dust in the air. "Bury me here." He stared the plea, chilling him more than the coming night. He thought she was just another grub line rider meeting her end. He was wrong. What this woman wanted wasn't just a space in his bone orchard, but the key to unlocking his own. The sun was a merciless god in this part of the territory. It baked the silence into the land, cracked the earth into a mosaic of thirst, and bleached the very memory of color from the sky. For 10 years, Jedediah Stone had made his peace with it. His ranch was not a home. It was a purgatory of dust and duty, a place that reeked of a solitude so profound it had its own heartbeat. A slow, tired rhythm that matched his own. Every morning he rose not to the sound of a voice, but to the first cruel rays of light. Every evening he sat not with a companion, but with the long skeletal shadows that crept from the distant mesas. Grief was a quiet tenant in the house of his heart. It didn't rage anymore. It simply existed like the rust on his tools or the wear on his saddle. It was the price of survival. He was mending a fence line near the southern edge of his property when he heard it. A sound that did not belong. Not the call of a hawk or the rustle of a snake through dry grass. It was a breath. A wet, ragged gasp that was more pain than air. Jedediah froze his hand, hovering over a rusted staple. His eyes narrowed against the glare, scanned the shimmering heat haze. The sound had come from the one place on this entire ranch he never went. Lillian's Folly. A wild, impossible grove of palm trees planted from seeds she'd had sent all the way from California. They stood in defiant green against the endless brown, a testament to a love and a hope he had long since buried. The place was sacred ground, haunted by the ghost of her laughter. He hadn't set foot in it since the funeral. He moved toward it now, his steps reluctant, his worn boots crunching on the parched earth. The air grew cooler under the shade of the broad whispering fronds, and there at the base of the largest palm lay a woman. She was a ruin, her dark dress torn and stained, a bloody blossom spreading across her side. He knelt not with pity, but with the grim, weary assessment of a man used to finding death in his pastures. Her skin was clammy, her breathing a shallow death rattle. Who did this? His voice was a rasp, rough from disuse. Her eyes, dark and deep, fluttered open. They weren't wild with fear, but held a strange, urgent clarity. She didn't seem to hear his question. Her gaze was fixed on the canopy of green above them. "So beautiful," she whispered in a voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. "I'm riding for the sheriff," Jedediah said, his tone flat. It was the only proper thing to do, the only logical thing. "No," she gasped, a surprising strength in her grip as her hand shot out and seized his wrist. "No, Sheriff. Please." Why? The question hung in the hot, still air. Why would a dying woman refuse the law? Jedediah stared at her, the complication of her presence a sudden, unwelcome weight. He was a man who lived by simple, brutal truths. You work, you eat. You get shot, you die. You find a body, you get the law. She was breaking the rules. Her grip loosened, her strength failing. Her dark eyes found his again, and the urgency in them was a physical force. Por favor, she begged her plea, a fragile thread of sound. Bury me. Here. He was silent. The world seemed to stop. The wind held its breath. Of all the things she could have asked for water, a doctor, a priest, she asked for a grave. In Lillian's garden. It was a desecration, a violation of the only holy place he had left. I can't do that, he said, his voice hard. Her eyes filled with a desperate light, a final guttering flame. You must, she insisted, her breath catching on a sob of pain. He cannot find me, even in death. Promise me. Geronimo, bury me here. She pointed a trembling finger to the soft earth at the base of the palm tree, the very spot where Lillian used to sit and read. Jedediah felt a cold dread wash over him, colder than any winter night. This stranger was asking him to dig up his own heart and bury her in its place. He looked from her pleading eyes to the whispering palms, and for the first time in a decade, the ghost of his wife felt terribly, painfully close. He thought she was just another soul, lost to the harshness of the West. He was wrong. She was a key, and she was begging him to turn the lock on a door he never even knew existed. The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of rust and old bruises. In the cool of the coming night, the woman's body grew still. The finality of it was absolute, a silent, heavy stone dropped into the placid pool of Jedediah's existence. He was alone again, but now his solitude was shared with a corpse and a promise he had no right to keep. He should get the sheriff. The thought was a stubborn, grating refrain in his mind. It was the law. It was sense. A bullet hole in a stranger was the business of a man with a badge. He could walk away, wash his hands of it, and in a few days, the silence on his ranch would return deeper and more complete than before. But her words echoed in the whispering fronds. He cannot find me, even in death. Who was this he? A husband, a killer? The question was a hook snagging the edge of his carefully constructed apathy. To fetch the sheriff would be to hand her over to the very world she was fleeing. It would bring loud, questioning men into this grove, their heavy boots trampling the last quiet corner of his life, the last piece of Lillian that remained. He looked down at the dead woman, a stranger who had somehow stumbled into the heart of his grief. A bitter, weary resolve settled in his gut. He would bury her. He would do this one last mad thing, and then the world could go to hell in its own time. He owed it not to her, but to the ghost that guarded this garden. He fetched a shovel from the barn, its worn wood smooth in his calloused hands. The steel scraped against the dry ground as he walked back, the sound and obscenity in the hallowed quiet. He stood over the spot she had indicated, the earth beneath the great palm. He remembered Lillian sitting right here, a book in her lap, her laughter like the chime of clear water. Forgive me, Lily. The thought was a prayer he hadn't known he was capable of. The first thrust of the shovel was the hardest. It felt like a betrayal, breaking the sacred skin of this place. The earth was soft, loamy, unnaturally so. Lillian had worked this soil, enriching it with compost from the creek bed. Digging here was like digging through layers of his own memory. The scent of damp earth filled the air, mingled with the faint, sweet perfume of night-blooming flowers she had planted a lifetime ago. Deeper. The rhythm of the work took over. Thrust, lift, toss. A grim, steady beat under the rising moon. He worked until sweat dripped from his brow, his mind blessedly empty, focused only on the task. Then the sound. A dull, hollow thud. Not the sharp clink of rock. It was the sound of steel on wood. Jedediah stopped, his muscles tensed. He jabbed the shovel again, gently this time. Thump. He narrowed his eyes. A root, perhaps. A thick, gnarled root from the palm. But the sound was too uniform, too manufactured. A cold knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He dropped the shovel and knelt the damp soil cool against the knees of his worn trousers. He clawed at the dirt with his bare hands, his fingers brushing against something flat and solid, a plank. He worked faster, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He uncovered the edge of it, then another. It was a makeshift lid, a series of rotting boards laid side by side. It wasn't old, maybe a few years at most. A tremor of something dark and primal. A fear he hadn't felt in a decade snaked up his spine. Who would bury a box in Lillian's garden? With a grunt, he pried the first plank loose. It splintered, releasing the smell of decay and trapped secrets. He reached into the darkness beneath. His fingers closed around something small, cold, and metallic. He pulled it out, lifting it into the pale moonlight, and his hands began to tremble. It was a silver locket, tarnished but unmistakable. A chain delicate as a spider's thread was still attached. He didn't need to open it. He knew the delicate engraving on the surface, an elegant, swirling L. He knew the satisfying click of its clasp. He knew the heft and feel of it more intimately than he knew his own reflection. It was the locket he had given Lillian on their first anniversary. The one he had personally tearfully clasped around her cold neck as she lay in her coffin, his final gift to his dead wife. It was impossible. It was a nightmare. But it was here, cold and solid in his trembling palm. If Lillian's locket was here, buried in a secret box beneath the palms, then who in God's name had he buried in her grave? The world narrowed to the small silver object in his hand. Time stopped. The moon froze in the sky. The whispering of the palms became a roar in his ears. The locket lay cool and heavy against his skin, a solid, undeniable fact, in a world that had just dissolved into a nightmare. He could feel the ghost of Lillian's warmth on the metal, a cruel trick of memory. He remembered the day of the funeral. The town suffocating in its Sunday best, their faces masks of pity. He remembered the undertaker's soft, cloying words about the closed coffin, about sparing him the sight of the damage from the accident. An act of mercy, the man had called it. An act of mercy. Jedediah had stood by the grave, a hollowed-out man, and before they lowered her into the earth, he had leaned in the scent of pine and lilies overwhelming him, and fastened this very locket around her neck. His last touch, his final goodbye, a memory he had revisited 1,000 times in the darkest hours of the night. A sacred private agony. And it had all been a lie. His trembling stopped. A terrifying stillness took its place, a calm at the center of a hurricane. The grief that had been his constant companion for a decade, a dull, heavy cloak, began to burn away, revealing something raw and incandescent beneath it. It was rage, pure cold and absolute. Silas. The name whispered by the dying woman was no longer a mystery. It was a verdict. Silas Blackwood, his partner, his friend, the man who had put a comforting hand on his shoulder at the funeral, the man who had gently suggested Jedediah sell off his shares in their freight company for a fraction of their worth to unburden himself, the man who had prospered while Jedediah had withered, the dead woman in the garden, the bullet in her side. She hadn't stumbled here by accident. She had been crawling to this exact spot, a messenger from a past he never knew existed. She had come to deliver the truth, and someone had tried to silence her. He dropped the locket as if it were burning coal. He scrambled out of the shallow grave, leaving the dead woman the shovel, the open earth behind. They didn't matter now. Only one thing mattered. Proof. He ran. He did not walk. He ran from the grove, a place of love, now tainted with deceit, his long legs eating up the ground, to the barn. He threw the saddle onto his startled horse with frantic, desperate movements, his hands acting on pure, primal instinct. He rode out into the night, not a man, but a vessel of fury, a thundercloud about to break. He galloped across his own land, the familiar landscape now alien and hostile, a stage for a decade-long lie. The lights of the town were a hateful, glittering smear in the distance. He bypassed them, heading straight for the low hill on the edge of town where the silent white stones stood sentinel under the moon. The cemetery, the bone orchard. He tethered his horse to the iron gate and stalked through the rows of sleeping dead, his boots leaving dark prints in the dew-kissed grass. He found the gravestone easily. Its shadow was etched into his soul. Lillian Stone, beloved wife, 1845, 1868. He looked at the engraved lie, and a sound tore from his throat, a raw, guttural cry that was half sob, half snarl. He had brought the shovel. He began to dig. There was no reverence this time, no gentle prayer. He attacked the earth with a savage fury, clawing away the life he had built on this lie. Clods of dirt flew, peppering the nearby stones. The sound of the shovel striking, scraping, and slicing through the soil was the only sound in the world, a frantic, desperate heartbeat. He was no longer a rancher. He was a grave robber. He was an avenger. He was a man digging his way out of hell. His shovel struck wood. The coffin. He threw the shovel aside and dropped into the grave, the dirt walls closing in around him. He tore at the lid with his bare, bleeding fingers. The wood was damp and swollen, but it splintered under his rage. With a final desperate heave, the lid cracked and gave way. He stared down into the darkness, his chest heaving, his heart hammering against his ribs. The stench of stale earth and cheap pine filled his nostrils. The moonlight spilled into the opening, illuminating what lay within. It was not empty. He saw the outline of a skeleton clad in the tattered remains of a simple dress. But it wasn't the bones that held his gaze. It was the rocks. Large, heavy river stones placed carefully around the skeleton, a grotesque and deliberate deceit to give the coffin weight, to give the lie substance. He had spent 10 years mourning a lie. He had wasted a decade of his life honoring a stranger's bones. The rage solidified into something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. The widower was gone, and in his place in the bottom of an open grave, a killer was born. The first light of dawn spilled over the tombstones, a pale, sterile wash of gray. It found Jedediah Stone sitting on the edge of the open grave, the shovel idle in his hands. He was not a man anymore. He was a monument carved from silence and fury, his face caked with the dirt of his own life's lie. The rage had not left him. It had simply cooled, condensing from a raging fire into a solid, heavy thing in his gut, a purpose. He did not leave the grave open. With a slow, deliberate economy of motion, he began to fill it in. Each shovelful of dirt was an act of erasure. He was not just covering a stranger's bones. He was burying the man he had been for the last 10 years. He was burying the fool who had drowned his sorrow in solitude while his wife's killer grew fat and respected in the nearby town. He packed the earth down, replaced the sod with meticulous care, leaving the monument to a phantom standing just as it had before. A perfect lie for a perfect crime. The ride back to the ranch was a journey through a foreign land. The sun rose but brought no warmth. The familiar mesas and canyons, once the silent companions of his grief, now seemed to be mocking him, their shadows hiding a decade of secrets. Every rock, every twisted juniper felt like a silent witness to his ignorance. He saw it all now with a terrible crystalline clarity. The pieces of the past clicked into place, each one a small, sharp betrayal. Silas with his sad smiles and cheap whiskey. Silas with his talk of bad investments and the need to sell. Silas, whose name the dying woman had gasped like a curse. He returned not to his house, but to the palm grove. The body of the woman, Elena, he decided to call her a name as soft as the life she'd been denied, lay where he had left her. He knelt beside her, and this time there was no grim practicality in his gaze. There was only a profound, aching debt. "You tried to tell me," he whispered, his voice a low rasp. "You crawled all this way to tell me." She was not a stranger. She was a soldier fallen on the field of his own private war. She was Lillian's friend. The thought was a certainty solid, as the locket he had retrieved and now held tight in his fist. He owed her more than a grave. He owed her justice. He gently searched the pockets of her worn, dusty dress. He was not a thief, but a historian searching for the last chapter of a story he should have been a part of. He found little: a few coins, a dried sprig of lavender that crumbled to dust at his touch, and a small folded piece of oilcloth. Inside was a photograph, its edges soft with wear. It showed two women, their arms linked, squinting against a bright, unfamiliar sun. One was younger, her face full of a fierce, protective loyalty. Elena. The other was Lillian, but a different Lillian than the one in his memories. She was thinner, her eyes holding a deep, weary sadness, but she was alive. Unmistakably, terrifyingly alive. He turned the photograph over. On the back, written in a faint, delicate script, was a single word: Esperanza. Hope. Was it a place, a person, a final, desperate prayer? It was a clue. It was the first thread he could pull to unravel the entire monstrous tapestry of Silas's deceit. He carried Elena's body from the grove, wrapping her in a clean canvas sheet from the barn. He would give her a proper burial, a quiet one on a hill overlooking the ranch. But first there was a ritual to attend to. He walked into the house he had shared with Lillian. It was a shrine, everything left just as she had liked it. Her portrait hung over the cold hearth, her painted eyes full of a life he now knew had been stolen, not lost. He stood before it for a long moment, the man in the open grave meeting the gaze of the woman in the photograph. There were no tears left. "I know Lily," he said to the silence, "and I'm coming." He turned and walked to the wall where his guns had rested, decorative and dormant, for years. He took down his Colt Peacemaker and his Winchester rifle. He sat at the kitchen table, the locket and the photograph laid out before him like sacred texts. With the slow, steady hands of a surgeon, he began to clean the weapons. The familiar smell of gun oil filled the small house, chasing away the scent of stale grief. The click of the hammer, the slide of the loading gate, these were the sounds of his resurrection. He was no longer just a rancher. The widower was dead and buried. He looked out the window toward the town shimmering in the heat. He was a hunter now, and he knew his prey's name. He rode into town looking like a ghost summoned by a forgotten sin. For 10 years, Jedediah Stone had been a rumor, a hermit rancher swallowed by his own grief. His return was a disruption, a stone tossed into the stagnant, dusty waters of the town's daily life. Men stopped their conversations to watch him pass, their eyes lingering on the new hard set of his jaw, the cold fire that had replaced the familiar vacant sadness in his eyes. He saw the town not as a place of commerce and community, but as a predator's den, every storefront window a watchful eye, every welcoming smile a potential lie. His first stop was not the sheriff's office nor the undertaker's parlor. It was the saloon, the heart of the town's hypocrisy, where deals were made and secrets were drowned in cheap whiskey. He didn't come for a drink. He came to hunt. He took a table in the darkest corner, his back to the wall, his face obscured by shadow. The air was thick with the familiar smells of stale beer, sweat, and sawdust. He ordered a water and let the noise of the room wash over him, his senses alert, his gaze sweeping the crowd with a predator's patience. And then he saw him. Silas Blackwood stood at the bar, the very picture of frontier prosperity. He was thicker in the middle now, his face florid, his waistcoat straining at the buttons. He held a glass of brandy in one hand and the town mayor's ear in the other, his laughter a booming, confident sound that filled the room. He was a pillar of the community, a respected man, a killer, a thief. Jedediah watched him, his hand resting on his thigh, inches from the worn leather of his holster. A universe of violence churned beneath his calm exterior. It would be so easy. A few steps, the drawing of a gun, and a final satisfying reckoning. But that wasn't justice. That was just an ending. He needed the story first. He needed to know what had become of Lillian. He needed to honor the messenger, Elena. As if feeling the weight of Jedediah's stare, Silas turned from the bar. His gaze swept the room, and for a fleeting electric moment their eyes met. Silas's smile faltered. A flicker of confusion crossed his face, the look of a man seeing a ghost at his own party. He saw Jedediah Stone, the recluse, the broken widower, sitting in the shadows watching him with an unnerving stillness. Jedediah didn't move a muscle. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply held Silas's gaze, a silent declaration of war that was more terrifying than any spoken threat. Silas, recovering his composure, gave a dismissive, almost pitying shake of his head and turned back to the mayor. But the seed of unease had been planted. The ghost was no longer content to stay on the ranch. Jedediah finished his water and left, melting out of the saloon as quietly as he had entered. He had confirmed the scent of his prey. Now he had to find the trail. Esperanza. His steps led him to the crumbling adobe walls of the old Spanish mission at the town's edge, a place of quiet faith and long memories. He found the parish priest, a man named Father Miguel, tending to a small garden of chilies and herbs. The priest was old, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes holding a deep, gentle wisdom. "Can I help you?" my son the priest asked, his voice soft. Father Jedediah began, his own voice sounding loud and harsh in the peaceful courtyard. "I'm looking for a place, or perhaps a person. I only have a name." Esperanza. Father Miguel looked at him, his gaze perceptive, seeming to see the turmoil behind Jedediah's stoic facade. "Esperanza is hope, Senor," he said gently. "It can be many things to many people, a prayer on the lips of the desperate." He paused, wiping the dirt from his hands onto his cassock. "But yes, there was a place, the mission of Our Lady of Hope, Misión de Nuestra Señora de la Esperanza. We just called it Esperanza." Jedediah's heart hammered against his ribs. "Where was it?" 2 days' ride south of here near the border, the priest explained, his expression growing sad. It was not a formal mission, more of a sanctuary run by a brave woman named Sister Maria, a refuge for women who were running from difficult lives. It was a place of healing. He sighed, a heavy, weary sound. "But it is gone now. There was a fire 6 years ago. It burned to the ground. A terrible accident, they said. Sister Maria and several of the women with her, they were lost. A sanctuary for women on the run. A fire, an accident. The pieces were no longer just clicking into place. They were forming a roadmap, a direct, brutal line from Lillian's empty grave to a pile of ashes 2 days south of here. Silas hadn't just staged a death. He had pursued her. He had hunted her down. Jedediah stood in the quiet mission garden, the scent of chilies sharp in the air, but all he could smell was smoke. The trail was no longer cold. It was burning. Jedediah left town before the first hint of dawn, a solitary rider swallowed by the vast, pre-dawn darkness. He didn't look back. The town with its sleeping inhabitants and its waking ghosts was a cage he had just escaped. Now he was in the open, the cold desert air, a clean, sharp shock to his system. He was a man with a destination. A man with a map drawn in ash and betrayal. The journey south was a descent. The familiar rolling grasslands of his territory gave way to a harsher, more brutal landscape.